Hey guys, alright, today we are watching This Type of Bullet Caused an Entire Uprising. Now, based on the picture, the thumbnail of the photo, or brain work please, the thumbnail of the video is on a Indian soldier, or well, not an Indian soldier, I believe it was a Sikh soldier, which is important. No, it wasn't a Sikh, it was a... Was it just a typical, I guess, Indian soldier? I can't remember. Well, it is on the Indian Rebellion of 1857, which I have a book regarding that rebellion by Kim A. Wagner. Book right here. The Skull of Alam Beg. The Life and Death of a Rebel of 1857. This book is... How many pages is it? It's only like, it's just barely above 200 pages. It is a great book, by the way. I highly recommend reading it if you want to learn more about the 1857 rebellion, because honestly, I wouldn't be surprised that if one of the sources for this video was Wagner's book. What they mean by the type of bullet is because there was an issue among a certain group of soldiers inside of the Indian Army, or well, that consisted of the British Indian Army at the time. And it actually wasn't even British territory. This was East India Company still ruled India at this time. It wasn't under complete British jurisdiction at the time, or even British crown rule until the later part of the 1800s. There was a type of, I believe, animal fat or something that was used in the casings or wrappings of the bullet, and this went against certain religious and cultural customs for a certain group of people inside of India. Well, those people refused to use said bullet because of how it went against their culture. Then there was a bunch of confusion that occurred because of this. This confusion continued to spiral out of control until violence occurred. And then the British came in with their armies and brutally put down the rebellion. And when I mean brutally, I mean they would fire people out of cannons. Living people would be fired out of cannons. Yeah. Mass graves. It was horrible what occurred. But let us go into simple histories telling of the rebellion of 1857. And even one of the questions when I was reading this book in class, and one of the discussions that was brought up in class by my my peers and our professor, is it right to call this a rebellion? Because this is a separate culture. Is it really truly right to say that them fighting for their independence is a rebellion, a revolt? You know, like, why is it the British's right to, there's a negative connotation when it comes to revolutions and revolts. It kind of gives this feeling that the British are in charge of them and that they shouldn't be doing this, when this is their homeland and the British live thousands of miles away. I think I explained that kind of well. The obvious conversation that occurred around that topic was much more in depth than I just provided, because it lasted like an hour. But anyways, let's go ahead and just get started into the video.
Brought to you by Magellan TV, a brand new documentary streaming membership service founded by filmmakers, bringing you premium content and diving deep into the subject you want to learn more about. Magellan TV has the richest and most varied content.
Yes, it was the sepoys. All right, there we go. The sepoys, yeah. Sepoys? Sepoys. I think it's sepoy, right? Someone who knows how to speak the language, please correct me if I'm pronouncing it right. Sepoy is first option. Sepoy is number two. I think it's sepoy.
1857 through 1858. The Sepoy Uprising, which took place in India in 1857 through 1858, is seen as one of the most shocking insurrections to take place against a colonial power during the 19th century. Although the uprising was...
Yes and no. I think it's just shocking. I think the idea of it being shocking is because of how quickly it spiraled out of control. It spiraled really fast out of control. Was it preventable? Yes. Maybe. Possibly. Who knows? Who's to say? Another comment. The officers would be mainly white. Now, there would be officers of different cultures, especially in India. Now, obviously, the high-ranking officers would not be, natives. They would be white. They would be British. But there were officers that would be Indian, Sikh, sepoy, etc. And then the vast, vast majority of soldiers located here were not white. I think there's a number. I think maybe 20 to 40,000 were stationed there that were white. If that, maybe less than that. I can't remember. It's been several months since I read the book. But the vast, vast majority were of the Indian descent region.
Ultimately unsuccessful, it fundamentally changed the nature of British rule in the subcontinent and is sometimes known in India as the First War of Independence. British interest in India began in the form of a trade relationship with the Mughal Empire, and the East India Company was formed in 1600 to capitalize on this.
Yes.
Although the company's beginnings in the subcontinent were relatively humble, with trading outposts around Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras, its founding charter had granted it permission to wage war, and over the course of the 18th century, vast tracts of India and huge amounts of wealth came under the control not of the British state, but of this privately owned corporation. Needing to protect its Indian assets, the company began to recruit local soldiers and build up its own armies. These would eventually become known as the Bengal, Madras, and Bombay armies. By the early 1800s, these forces numbered nearly 200,000 men, and by the mid-19th century, over two-thirds of the Indian subcontinent was being run as a for-profit enterprise. Over the course...
Which, by the way, let's just take a moment to think about that. Nearly an entire subcontinent, an area of the world today that is home to 1.4 billion people, was ruled by a private corporation. Now, obviously, that private corporation answered to a government, because that is how they worked at that time. That private corporation was technically under the jurisdiction/rule of the British Empire. They had to answer, in a certain sense, to the crown. But for the most part, yeah, they were a for-profit corporation, separate entity from the British Crown in most cases.
Course of the 18th century, company policies had led to the deaths of huge numbers of Indians and seen almost unimaginable quantities of Indian treasures shipped back to Britain. In the first half of the 19th century, some attempts were made to change India's economic and legal systems and to bring about various social reforms. In fact, there was an increasing concern throughout India regarding the effects of westernization, especially the spread of Christianity and the resulting destruction of local cultures and traditions. From 1840,
there was indeed that fear that was prevalent throughout the members of the army that were of Indian cultures and such. There was definitely that prevalent fear that they had when it came to regarding the British, that, hey, these guys are going to remove our culture or something. That was definitely one of the crucial factors in what ended up spiraling out of control into the 1857 rebellion.
1849 onwards, the company began to reduce the number of British Army regiments in India, and by 1857, the Bengal Army was comprised of only 24,000 Europeans out of 159,000 men.
Okay, yeah, as I was saying earlier, with the amount of European descent and Indian descent.
This was particularly bad timing, as there was also growing discontent among the Indian soldiers. Violation of local customs, lack of promotion, and poor pay had led to resentment towards the British officers. has had recent attempts to recruit men from lower castes, which was taken by those from higher castes as an insult to their traditional status.
Yes, that was another thing. When it came to their culture at the time, the higher castes were originally, so it's very hard to explain in a short time period. Like, for instance, the class I was in which we studied this, roughly, I think probably a third of our semester was spent on this book. I think this book was the book we spent the most amount of time discussing. So it might be even more than that 33%. It might be up to like 40%. I would not be surprised if it pushed to that much taking up of our class time. So I'm gonna try and keep it rather simple in my explanation. I might fail, and I might be getting some things wrong or going over some things very quickly that obviously should be expanded upon, and I do highly recommend doing your own research in learning more about this rebellion, as it is a fascinating rebellion in learning how the British viewed certain things and how the Indian peoples, Indian cultures and such view different things. And I feel kind of weird saying just Indian cultures, because these people are not, like, I guess, Indian. They're part of the Indian subcontinent, but they are individuals. They were Sikhs, sepoys, Nepalese, I believe. You know, they came from everywhere in the region and had their own unique cultures to them. The British, of course, wanted more men in their armies. Well, that's kind of not how things worked in India. Or at least it worked differently. Obviously, being a part of the British Empire, they were limited on how far they could rise. Well, the British had a more, I guess one could say that they were more, in a sense, willing to acknowledge someone's skill and promote them because of their skill. Well, because of the certain culture at the time, in the prevalence of the caste system in India, those that were born part of the higher caste and they were put into the military for the British East India Company, and they would have to be fighting alongside someone born in the lower caste. To them, that was an insult, and that can bring issues, because to those of the higher caste, it's seen as the British forcing their ways upon them, you know. Now, obviously, the British were not completely innocent. Of course, I'm not saying that. The British did not always, you know, promote those that deserved it to proper positions. They did have their nobility, of course, that would be given preferential treatment. But it was still different in certain ways that, you know, allowed issues to arise.
The final spark of the already growing revolt came in the form of new cartridges that were issued for use with the new Enfield rifle. A rumor began to spread throughout the troops that the cartridge paper was greased with either cow or pig fat.
I am starting to truly believe that Simple History did indeed use Wagner's book, because Wagner directly calls it rumors being spread, that the British were, you know, lying in a sense to the Indian soldiers, and that they were going to have to use these big cartridges.
This made their use difficult on religious grounds for both Hindu and Muslim soldiers, as the cartridges had to be bitten in order to load the rifle, and their religions forbade eating beef or pork. Further to that, it added fuel to the belief that there was an ongoing attempt to Christianize the country and undermine local customs. On March 29, 1857, Sepoy Mangal Pandey of the 34th Bengal Native Infantry, then stationed at Barrackpore, attacked and wounded several officers. During the incident, he reportedly called out, "Come out, you! The Europeans are here. From biting these cartridges, we shall become infidels. Get ready. Turn out, all of you." Although his attempt to start an all-out mutiny amongst his fellow soldiers failed, several of them did refuse direct orders to intervene. When it became clear that he would be arrested, Pandey turned his musket on himself and fired directly into his chest. Despite the short range, the wound wasn't fatal, and Pandey was put on trial less than a week later, found guilty, and sentenced to death. The outbreak proper began a couple of months later, on the 10th of May at Meerut, when 85 soldiers of the Bengal Light Cavalry, who had been imprisoned for refusing to use the new cartridges, were set free by the rest of their regiment. The military station was then destroyed, and any Europeans they found murdered. The British were caught on the back foot and were slow to react, allowing the rebellion to spread out from Meerut and take hold across the rest of central and northern India. At the time of the uprising, there were only 35,000 British soldiers in the whole of the subcontinent, and the wait for reinforcements would take months. Fortunately for the British, though, support for the uprising was not universal amongst the Indian population. The Madras and Bombay armies remained largely loyal to the British, as did Punjabi, Muslims, Sikhs, and Gurkhas, who had no interest in seeing a return to Mughal rule.
Which is extremely important and shows really the complexity of the situation in the area. It was not necessarily a popular rebellion. It was, I guess, in a sense, popular to a certain group of people. But here's the thing: one of the reasons behind the rebellion was that new cartridge. Well, the use of that new cartridge really only affected soldiers. It did not affect the general population. So getting the general population on your side of the rebellion is a little bit harder. And also going back to the rule of the Mughal Empire may not have been seen as preferential to the general populace, while they may have preferred the British rule over the old Mughal rule. So it's a very complex situation that honestly I don't think I would even risk tackling in a 13-minute video. But he's doing a pretty good job so far. He's obviously brushing over certain things. Like, we're already in the midst of the rebellion within the 5 minutes. I think it took us 2 weeks before we really started discussing the actual rebellion in class.
Rulers also reacted in a variety of different ways. Some were loyal to Britain or wished to remain neutral. Others, though, were angry at the way they had been treated by the company and chose to rebel. There were several major centers of the rebellion: Delhi, Kanpur, Lucknow, Jhansi, and Gwalior. Delhi, under the rule of the now largely powerless Mughal emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar, was a strategically important city and the first destination for the mutineers from Meerut. They went there seeking Zafar's blessing for the uprising, which he reluctantly gave. On their arrival, the city's Christians, whether European or Indian, were massacred. The loss of Delhi was a huge blow for the British, and its recapture became an immediate priority. With the army spreading over a vast distance, though, gathering enough men to retake the city was a time-consuming task, which meant that an immediate counterattack was impossible. By June 8th, a small force of 4,000 men had managed to capture a ridge just outside Delhi, but with 30,000 mutineers inside the city, this was still not enough to attempt a full-on assault. The 4,000 men on the ridge were forced to spend the summer months desperately holding their position against continuous attacks, whilst dealing with searing heat and outbreaks of disease within the camp. It was not until September 14th, by which time a force of 9,000 men had been scraped together, that an attack on the city was considered practical. British gunners were able to breach the walls, and the Kashmir Gate was destroyed, allowing British forces to flood into the city. The fighting was bitter, and it was another week before the mutineers were finally suppressed, and Delhi once again became a British possession. In the immediate aftermath of the assault, the residents of Delhi were once again made to suffer, this time at the hands of the British, as troops murdered and looted their way across the city. Kanpur was another strategically important city, situated at a major crossing point on the river Ganges, and at a crossroads between two major highways. In June 1857, local sepoys rose up and attacked the city's British garrison. Major General Sir Hugh Wheeler, the commander of the British garrison, along with 1,000 of his men, was forced to retreat to an entrenchment outside the city, where they were besieged for 3 weeks. Upon learning that a British relief force had been dispatched, Nana Sahib, a local ruler who was in command of the city's mutineers, offered the British soldiers safe passage down the river. As the men were boarding the boats that they believed were to take them to safety, they were ambushed and wiped out. On July
I hadn't heard
15th,
of that.
120
Or maybe I am forgetting it. I can't remember.
European women and children who had survived the initial uprising were massacred and their bodies disposed of down a well. The following day, the relief force, under the command of Major General Sir Henry Havelock, arrived. The British reprisals for the massacre were swift and so brutal that this period has colloquially become known as the Devil's Wind.
Yeah.
Many thousands of supposed mutineers were hanged without trial.
Yes, that is another very controversial thing. In fact, this rebellion and the British response also sparked, I feel it's very important to say, it sparked, it wasn't Europeans, other European countries spoke out. Other European countries spoke out against the British response, the brutal British response. The stories that came out, the British didn't necessarily want the world to know exactly what was going on in India. But word got out on how their response was and how swift and brutal it would be. It was. And they received some backlash for it. Obviously, not the kind of backlash maybe we in the modern day would like to see for executing even supposed mutineers. Like, a lot of people were killed that were just like there, that weren't even a part of the mutiny. They were just bystanders. They were executed too because I guess they didn't do anything to stop it, which is a very rough thing.
Certainly many innocent civilians were also killed. When trials did take place, the favored method of execution for those convicted of mutiny was known as blowing from a gun. Each man was tied with his back positioned against the muzzle of a cannon. The firing of the gun resulted in the head and limbs being blown off and the total destruction of the torso. That this method was chosen was significant for its violence, but also for the local religious customs. The complete collection of remains and ritual preparation of the body was utterly impossible, meaning that the punishment for the condemned was seen to extend from this life into the next. After these events, Kanpur was held by the British until late November, when it was once again retaken by the rebels. Their victory was short-lived though, as on December 6th, British forces once again attacked and retook the city for the final time. Lucknow, the capital of the state of Odisha, which had only been annexed in the previous year, was under the command of companyman Sir Henry Lawrence. On May 30th, the city became the site of yet another rebellion by local sepoys. Lawrence, already aware of reports about the uprising from other regions, had taken steps to reinforce his residency, and so was not completely unprepared when it was besieged at the end of June. Nevertheless, 1,600 soldiers, about half of whom were sepoys loyal to the British, and a similar number of civilians were trapped inside the residency until the end of November, when a relief force was finally able to break the rebel lines. Lawrence himself did not survive the siege, having been killed when a shell detonated in his room. A small garrison was stationed just outside of the city to curtail any offensive actions that the rebels might have planned. But it was not until the following March, when a large enough force had been gathered, that the city was finally recaptured. The final stages of the uprising took place in central India, mainly in the vicinity of Jhansi, a city under the control of Rani Lakshmi Bai. The Rani was sympathetic to the rebels and angry over the British annexation.
I can't remember if this part was covered in the book. I don't think I've heard of her before.
Of her state, and in June of 1857, locally stationed regiments from the Bengal Army rebelled. In March of 1858, British forces under the command of Major General Sir Hugh Rose marched on the city, and on the 22nd of that month, Jhansi was put under siege. The prospect of taking the city was an extremely challenging one. The fort was arguably one of the most formidable in India, and the city itself had a very effective military defense. Rose was a very competent and experienced commander, who at earlier stages in the campaign had been known to take several well-defended targets in just a few days. The siege at Jhansi, though, took 2 weeks to accomplish its aims. On April 3rd, the city walls were stormed, although bitter street fighting continued for several more days. The British, with their tempers no doubt inflamed by an earlier massacre of British soldiers, civilians, and Indian servants that had taken place inside the fortress, showed little sympathy of the inhabitants of Jhansi. At least 5,000 defenders were killed, including the entire adult male population of the city.
Really? The entire... Wow. I don't think... Oh, man. I don't remember that one being covered in the book either. Huh. I could just be, misremembering, of course. It could have been covered, but maybe in brief it was covered, I don't know. But yeah, that is just... As I was saying, the extent of the British response was brutal. Absolutely cruel.
Despite the savagery of the British attack and the determination that no one would be allowed to escape, the Rani did, in fact, manage to get away. Throughout the spring and early summer, Rose won a series of victories over the rebel forces. On the 17th of June, at Kota Ki Sarai, Rani Lakshmi Bai was killed in action. By this time, the rebels, under the command of the General Tatya Tope, had regrouped at Gwalior. It was here that on June 19th, and despite the last-minute defection of the Gwalior contingent to their side, the rebels were finally defeated, and the uprising was effectively brought to an end. The Sepoy uprising may have been defeated, but it ultimately brought about the downfall of the East India Company, although this did linger on in a diminished form until 1874. There had long been concern over the extent of its territories, and the uprising provided the necessary excuse to remove control of the Indian subcontinent from the company and place it in the hands of the British state. Several concessions were made in an attempt to ensure that the uprising would never be repeated. There was to be less direct interference by the British regarding local customs, and the number of British soldiers was increased. In 1877, Queen Victoria had herself declared Empress of India, forcing the local population to live under imperial rule until they finally won their independence on August 15, 1947.
Good video by Simple History. I think he covered the 1857 rebellion as well as he could in 13 minutes. It is such a complex and complicated time and year in Indian history that it would take hours upon hours to properly discuss it in the detail that is required, honestly. But fair enough job to... obviously, it's a Simple History. That's the channel name, so, history simple, in a simple form. And it did that job. It covered it simple. But yeah. Learned a bit. It reminded me of certain things that I had read in the book, in Wagner's book. But yeah, a good video. Hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to leave a suggestion down below for what I should react to next. Hit that like button and subscribe for more. I'll see you guys next time. Thank you.